I'm Leonard Sachs from the Office of Medical Policy, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. Together with my colleagues Beth Kunkoski, Matthew Diamond, Christina Webber and Anindita Saha, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the draft FDA guidance entitled The Use of Digital Health Technologies for Remote Data Acquisition in Clinical Investigations. We all recognize the extraordinary advances in digital technology over the past few decades. It's almost hard to remember life without cell phones, Fitbits, and portable computers. As digital devices become miniaturized, as their capacity for gathering sensor and other data grows, and their ability to transfer huge amounts of information increases, they have become an integral part of all of our lives. Their footprint in medical care is growing by the day, and we all recognize their considerable potential value in clinical trials. Our guidance identifies a digital health technology as a system that uses computing platforms, connectivity, software, and sensors for healthcare and related uses. As my colleagues will point out during this webinar, digital health technologies span a broad range of generally small, portable instruments that can make clinical measurements such as steps, breaths, heartbeats, blood pressure, and glucose levels. They can serve as platforms for patient data, for example, patient-reported outcome tools, and they can support interactive mobile apps to test things like coordination, hearing, vision, and cognition. Some digital health technologies like smartwatches can be worn. Others like glucose and cardiac monitors can be implanted, and some can be carried in patients' pockets. The types of data that they can obtain are novel. We can get continuous or frequent measurements. We can get data on rare events such as seizures and arrhythmias, and we can get measurements from patients in their real-world environments. Digital health technologies also provide opportunities to improve trial convenience for patients, allowing us to obtain trial data without having them report to clinical sites. With all this excitement, we must be sure that the data we get from digital health technologies are reliable, meaningful to patients and caregivers, and that patient confidentiality is addressed. This is no simple matter. Different actigraphy tools give different results. How do we decide which are correct? What DHT metrics should we be using to determine that a drug, for example for heart failure, is improving patients' clinical conditions? How do we interpret the terabytes of data from continuous recordings? And let's not forget that the entire initiative has no value unless patients are able to use their DHTs properly. With these questions in mind, this guidance is aimed to facilitate the responsible implementation of DHTs in clinical trials. The learning objectives of this webinar are to identify digital health technologies and clarify regulatory considerations, to identify factors for selecting a DHT for a clinical investigation, to differentiate verification, validation, and usability studies of DHTs, to construct endpoints from data collected using DHTs, and to design a clinical investigation using a DHT. At this point, I would like to introduce Matthew Diamond from the Digital Health Center of Excellence at FDA, who will begin the presentation focused on regulatory considerations for DHTs.
Thank you, Leonard. I'm Matthew Diamond, and I serve as the Chief Medical Officer at CDRH's Digital Health Center of Excellence. Before we begin discussing regulatory considerations, I'd like to express how pleased we are to be issuing a guidance to facilitate the use of digital health technologies in clinical trials of medical products, including drugs, biologics, and medical devices. DHTs can serve many roles, and they offer many potential benefits in clinical investigations. And in this guidance and this webinar, we're focused on the function of DHTs to acquire data remotely in those clinical trials. We're very excited that DHTs provide opportunities to record data directly from participants wherever they may be, allowing DHTs to help provide a broader picture of how patients feel or function in their daily lives. After all, there are incremental and sometimes subtle but very meaningful improvements in patients' experience of their condition that can be very difficult to measure. DHTs have the potential to help pick up on these differences. Additionally, some DHTs may facilitate the direct collection of information from participants who are unable to report their experiences, for example, individuals with cognitive impairment. And DHTs can facilitate participation of individuals who might not otherwise have good access to trials, thereby helping to ensure data used to develop and test medical products are representative of a diverse intended patient population. In this context, the use of DHTs represents not only an important opportunity for medical product development, it also represents an opportunity to promote health equity. Now, in order for DHTs to reach their potential, they must be used responsibly, and that means many things, some of which we'll be discussing today, including ensuring the DHT is actually measuring what it's intended to measure, and that it's intended to measure the things that matter to patients. That safety is paramount, considering both clinical and privacy-related risks, and that DHTs are used in a proactively patient-centered manner that takes into account issues including usability and accountability, and that promotes health equity. So let's begin by reviewing some highlights of the regulatory aspects of using DHTs in clinical trials, which are described in this draft guidance, and then I'll touch on some ways to engage with the agency on these issues. As you just heard from Dr. Sachs, digital health technologies represent a broad category of products that exhibit a wide spectrum of form and function. Some DHTs that can be used in a clinical investigation meet the definition of a medical device, while others do not. And I'm using the word device as it's defined by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in Section 201H listed here. Now, whether a particular DHT meets the definition of a device is beyond the scope of this draft guidance and webinar. And I'm not going to recite the device definition listed on this slide, but we've developed many resources to provide regulatory clarity for DHTs in general, which are all available on the FDA website. And we encourage you to reach out to us at the agency, including at CDRH and our Digital Health Center of Excellence. In a few minutes, we'll be highlighting some specific ways to engage with the agency. In this draft guidance and in today's webinar, we're talking about DHTs, both DHTs that are devices and DHTs that are not. Focusing for a moment on DHTs that are devices, I'd like to highlight two questions we're frequently asked. The first question is whether marketing authorization, in other words, pre-market clearance or approval, is necessary to use a DHT in a clinical investigation. And the short answer is generally no. Devices intended only for use in clinical investigations are typically exempt from many requirements applicable to devices, including pre-market clearance or approval, as long as the investigation complies with applicable requirements under 21 CFR Part A12, which are the Investigational Device Exemption Regulations. So we've just talked about whether marketing authorization is necessary to use a DHT in a clinical investigation. Now let's move on to another frequently asked question. Is marketing authorization, again pre-market clearance or approval, sufficient to show that a DHT is appropriate for use in a clinical investigation? And again, the short answer is generally no. A DHT's marketing authorization does not necessarily mean that it's appropriate for use in a particular clinical investigation. Sponsors are encouraged to leverage data that may be available from multiple sources, including marketing applications for the DHT when available, to support that the DHT is fit for purpose in a specific clinical investigation. And Beth Kunkoski and Christina Webber will talk more about what it means to be fit for purpose in a few minutes. Okay, we've highlighted some important regulatory considerations discussed in this guidance, and next I'd like to describe some recommendations for engaging with the agency. Sponsors should engage early with the appropriate center responsible for the medical product that is the primary subject of the investigation to discuss use of DHTs in a specific clinical investigation. And we've listed here some relevant guidances. Those related to drugs and biological products on the left, describing formal meetings between FDA and sponsors or applicants, and a guidance for medical devices on the right related to our Q submission program. We also encourage sponsors and manufacturers to utilize the voluntary qualification programs designed to support the development of tools for use in assessing medical products. For tools related to trials for drugs or biological products, there's the Drug Development Tool Qualification Program. For tools related to trials for devices, we have the Medical Device Development Tool Qualification Program. And for drug development tools that may be out of scope of the other qualification programs, there is the Innovative Science and Technology Approaches for New Drugs, or ISTAND, pilot program. These are all voluntary qualification programs that are independent of individual marketing submissions. So what are the benefits of participating in a development tool qualification program? Well, these qualification programs allow a DHT to be relied upon for multiple clinical investigations to support multiple different pre-market submissions, where the context of use is the same, for example, measurement of a specific outcome in a specific patient population, without having to repeat studies that supported the qualification. If you have questions about digital health technologies, including their regulatory status or the investigational device exemption regulations I mentioned earlier, you can contact the Digital Health Center of Excellence at CDRH, where our mission is to empower stakeholders to advance healthcare by fostering responsible and high-quality digital health innovation. And I've listed at the bottom of this slide our email address and website where you can ask questions about digital health regulatory policy, and we aim to provide a quick turnaround to your inquiries. We're eager to collaborate with you on using DHTs to continue to modernize clinical trials. Finally, before I pass the microphone to Beth Kunkoski, I'd like to acknowledge the collaboration across the agency in developing this guidance with the goal of providing regulatory clarity and harmonization for this important area. And we're looking forward to your input on this draft guidance to help inform our next steps. And with that, I will pass this off to Beth Kunkoski, who will be speaking about selecting a DHT for a clinical investigation. Beth?
Thank you, Matthew. My name is Beth Kunkoski. I am a Health Science Policy Analyst in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. Today, I will be discussing selecting a DHT for a clinical investigation. As Matthew mentioned, DHTs used in clinical investigations should be fit for purpose. This means you've reached a conclusion that the level of validation associated with the DHT is sufficient to support its proposed use. Next, the fit for purpose DHT should support the endpoint for the clinical investigation. The endpoint is a precisely defined variable intended to reflect an outcome of interest that is statistically analyzed to address a particular research question. To actually select a DHT for a clinical investigation, there are many considerations. The ability of the DHT to measure a clinical event or characteristic of interest. What are you using the DHT for? The DHT should be usable for the proposed patient population. Consider the education, language, age, and technical aptitude of trial populations, for example, pediatrics to elderly. Next, think about the design and operation of the DHT. What does the DHT look like? How big is it? Will patients wear it for the protocol-defined duration? How often should the DHT be charged? What are the operational specifications, such as data storage capacity, frequency of data transmission? What role does the participant play in ensuring the sponsor has access to data? DHT alerts, such as low battery, poor signal, data errors. Does it have the right balance of notifying participants without them wanting to stop using the DHT? In addition, what is the availability and capacity of network systems to handle data collected by the DHT? It is likely participants will have their own personal DHT or general purpose computing platform. Sponsors should consider if participants may be permitted to use a personal DHT or general purpose computing platform for remote data acquisition in a clinical investigation. Some considerations the sponsors should think about when designing a bring your own approach include performance specifications for measuring clinical events or characteristics. You should have confidence the DHT will measure the data to support the endpoint of interest for the clinical investigation, and the measurements will be consistent across all personal DHTs. Define the minimum technical specifications, for example, operating system, storage capacity, sensors, to ensure consistency in data collection. The sponsor should identify specific DHTs or general purpose computing platforms, for example, the brand, model, or version, that meet the minimum technical and performance specifications. The sponsor should ensure availability of telecommunication technologies such as broadband or cellular networks to ensure data collection. Additionally, sponsors should still provide the option of sponsor-provisioned DHTs, general purpose computing platforms, or telecommunication technologies to participants. You do not want to exclude potential participants that do not have access to their own DHT. Thank you. Now Christina Webber will continue with verification, validation, and usability studies.
Thanks, Beth. I'm Christina Webber, a Regulatory Science Program Manager at the Center for Devices in Radiological Health, or CDRH. Now that we've gone through some considerations when selecting a DHT for use in a clinical investigation, I'm going to cover verification, validation, and usability studies associated with DHTs when used in clinical investigations. Key to ensuring that a DHT is fit for purpose in a given clinical investigation are verification and validation. I've included definitions from the draft guidance on the slide. During verification, you're checking to see that the DHT is measuring the physical parameter of interest accurately and precisely over time. So, is my DHT picking up on the accelerations that I would expect it to experience during the clinical investigation? Verification might be viewed as part of the validation process by some. Validation, on the other hand, is making sure that the DHT is appropriately assessing the clinical event or characteristic in the clinical population of interest for the investigation. Verification and validation may begin with benchtop studies, then progress to studies with healthy volunteers, and then move on to studies enrolling individuals representing the clinical population of interest. When appropriate, third-party verification and validation data may be used by sponsors to demonstrate that a DHT is fit for purpose in their clinical investigation. Validation studies may occur in a variety of environments, like the controlled lab setting, or maybe a simulated living environment, or perhaps the real world, collecting real world data from participants. Another factor to consider when planning validation studies is the appropriate population to enroll. This really depends on whether or not the measurement of interest would be similarly collected from a healthy participant versus a participant representing the clinical population of interest. So, for example, a heart rate measurement may be comparable between healthy volunteers and participants with Parkinson's disease, but a measurement of gait, such as step count, might not be comparable between the two populations, given the disturbances in gait experienced by patients with Parkinson's disease. If you intend to use a DHT that has a hardware component like an accelerometer or other sensor, then some additional items should be taken into consideration during verification and validation. During verification, you're looking to test the DHT and see if it meets the performance standards out there, which can include testing against an existing consensus standard or identification of potential failure modes and the effects that might have on the clinical investigation, including participant safety. Further, a DHT should operate reliably in conditions that would be reasonably expected in the clinical investigation. So verification testing could also include identifying the appropriate temperature, humidity, or other operating conditions. When participants are able to bring their own DHT or general purpose computing platform, like a smartphone, tablet, or laptop, it is important to verify that measurements are consistent across the various protocol-specified items so that one participant's measurements would have an equal playing field with the other participants' measurements if the DHT or general purpose computing platform did differ. During validation, you might want to involve DHT manufacturers, patients, caregivers, or other technical and clinical experts to help along with the process and to help gain appropriate data and demonstrate that a DHT is fit for purpose. This could be of help, especially when you're comparing measurements with reference standards or evaluating factors that might affect the precision and accuracy of a measurement, like how a DHT is placed on the body. Another issue that should be considered is calibration when it is needed, and this is to ensure that accurate and precise measurements are consistent throughout the study. DHT software might be run on a variety of general purpose computing platforms. Like I said, that could either be a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, or other personal computer. When you're using a DHT or a general purpose computing platform, to administer electronic clinical outcome assessments or other assessments like an electronic patient-reported outcome instrument or perhaps a visual acuity test for patients, you definitely want to consider the usability of that setup. Also, like other clinical outcome assessments, there are specific considerations for verification and validation, including content validation, construct validation, normative testing. These items are covered in other guidance documents available from the FDA. Furthermore, another consideration on the software side of things is when you're looking at the general purpose computing platform that your software might be running on, is this appropriate for use in the clinical investigation? Will the data be reliably collected and transmitted throughout the clinical investigation? Digital health technologies are inherently interconnected. Clinical investigations rely on a DHT to be able to transmit data from a participant where they are at in their life at that point to the study team who might be in a completely different state or across the country. So it's critical that the data is transmitted effectively and securely. This information should be exchanged in a way that does not lose integrity. The interoperability of a digital health technology should be evaluated to make sure that when it is in that connected system, the electronic interfaces perform as intended and that the data gets from point A to point B as expected, so that when the analysis is done, the measurements may be interpreted appropriately. Usability studies are another key component to help you confirm if a DHT is fit for purpose for the proposed use in a clinical investigation. So this is something where you would want to enroll a population that is similar to the trial population to see how they would interact with a given DHT. Some items to consider have been highlighted in the center of the slide here. So this first one is focusing on whether or not a participant would be able to put on or take off a DHT or general purpose computing platform used in the clinical investigation. This becomes particularly important if positioning is key for accurate and precise measurements, and also if you have a population with limited dexterity. This might be something that could end up in either further training for participants or study staff, or even a tweak in the DHT. The middle one here, logging on or logging off, really focuses on will the participant need to log on each time? Are they going to have to remember a new password and a new username each time? The fewer barriers to entry, the less burdensome a clinical trial is on a participant. So considering how to potentially streamline that process or make it easier for someone to have the data collection in the easiest manner is helpful, especially when considering retention of subjects. And then this last one here, think about whether or not the participants are going to need to start or stop the data collection, or maybe need reminders on completing a data entry. This is something that you want to consider, as missing or sparse data could prove to be difficult in analysis. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Beth, who will be discussing endpoints.
Thank you, Christina. Now I will discuss the evaluation of clinical endpoints from data collected using DHTs and other considerations. Part of assessing if a DHT is fit for purpose is identifying the endpoint for the clinical investigation. Some DHTs can measure established endpoints, but we will certainly see many novel endpoints derived from DHT data. When using data from a DHT to inform an endpoint, begin by treating the endpoint like you would any other endpoint. Define the endpoint. Next, justify why this is the most appropriate endpoint for the patient population. Third, identify if this is a safety or efficacy endpoint, and then positioning, such as primary, secondary, or exploratory endpoint. Carefully considering all of these points will set the clinical investigation up for success. For novel endpoints, there are additional considerations that should be incorporated into endpoint development. However, the guiding principles for developing any novel endpoint are applicable for those that include a DHT. Is the endpoint a clinically meaningful reflection of how a participant feels, functions, or survives? This requires input from many stakeholders, such as patients, disease experts, caregivers, clinicians, engineers, and regulators. Next, does the endpoint relate to other endpoints of effectiveness for similar indications for use? This might be considered the justification. Is the endpoint a reliable measure of disease severity or health status to allow assessment of disease modification or progression? Can you assess whether the effect of an existing medical product with an established endpoint can be detected using the novel endpoint? This would be identifying a positive control for a trial. The use of DHTs in a clinical investigation introduces some risks into a clinical trial. Some examples of clinical risks include: are there physical features of the DHT that could harm a patient? Is a DHT reusable? Will the DHT measurements be used to alter treatment? For example, a continuous glucose meter. Are there cybersecurity risks that may impact the DHT operation? Unfortunately, as everything becomes a computer, there is a risk of a DHT being hacked. Subjects should have the ability to manually override software to ensure their own safety and well-being. There are also privacy-related risks. There are some basic concerns of potential disclosure of identifiable information via breach of the DHT, general purpose computing platform, or durable electronic data repository. To use most DHTs or general purpose computing platforms, participants should understand who has access to their data and that it may be used by third parties outside the scope of the clinical investigation. The informed consent is an important tool for disclosure of this information. Sponsors should ensure security safeguards are in place to secure data at rest and in transit to prevent access by intervening or malicious parties. Some additional considerations. I won't go into too much detail here. There is plenty of information available in the guidance. Participant and staff training. The success of the clinical investigation depends on participants and trial personnel being able to set up and operate DHTs for the duration of the trial. It is worth the time and investment upfront to ensure everyone involved knows how to operate the DHT and address problems as they arise. There will be problems with technology throughout the clinical investigation. Technical support should be available for the duration for both personnel and participants. There will also be changes and updates to the DHTs during the course of a clinical investigation. The sponsor should have contingency plans in place for addressing these changes. Sponsors should also address if there are meaningful differences observed in the analysis of data that may be a result of the changes or updates. Record protection and retention. The primary goal of using ADHT in a clinical investigation is generally to remotely acquire data to support an endpoint in a clinical investigation. To have confidence in that data, the sponsor must consider 21 CFR Part 11. Due to the variety of DHTs that can be used in applications, sponsors should work directly with review divisions to discuss the type of data recorded from each participant to be submitted as part of a review. There will be some great variability here and some considerations on the FDA's ability to accept and analyze such data. The data output of the DHT to support an endpoint for the clinical investigation and associated metadata should generally be transmitted to a durable electronic data repository. These data can take the form of discrete clinical events measured using built-in analytics. For example, heartbeats, breaths, steps, or continuous recordings, for example, electrocardiograms, among other things. For data collected directly from trial participants through DHTs, FDA would generally consider the data in the Durable Electronic Data Repository to constitute the source data. Review of these data may be necessary to reconstruct and evaluate the clinical investigation, and the data should be available for inspection. For further information, please see FDA's draft guidance, Use of Electronic Records and Electronic Signatures in Clinical Investigations, under 21 CFR Part 11, Questions and Answers. Thank you. Now, Anindita Saha will walk us through an example of selecting a DHT and endpoint for a clinical investigation.
Thank you, Beth. I'm Anindita Saha. I'm Assistant Director in the Digital Health Center of Excellence at CDRH at FDA. I'm going to walk through one of the hypothetical scenario examples that we used in the draft guidance and then some concluding remarks before we turn it over to audience Q&A. So one of the examples we highlight in the draft guidance is a hypothetical scenario about using multiple digital health technologies that can be used in one clinical investigation to inform endpoints. So the scenario is evaluating a medical product to treat a pulmonary disease. So in the example, we talk about a clinical investigation that's remotely measuring different aspects of a participant's function using multiple digital health technologies. This includes an FDA-cleared spirometer that has smart connectivity, a consumer activity tracker, and a mobile app that is administered on a smartphone or tablet where participants rate their perceived functioning daily. So when we think about walking through this example, I'm going to highlight what is the purpose of these different DHTs and what are they trying to accomplish. So when you're thinking about the thought process for the use of digital health technologies to measure some kind of clinical event or characteristic of interest, you want to think about the purpose of using the DHT through that clinical investigation. So for the first instance, you have the DHT that can collect data of interest more frequently than you would in a traditional setting. By using the spirometer, you can collect that information remotely from a patient on a more frequent basis versus during a clinic visit when a participant might come in for Secondly, when you're thinking about DHTs, in this case, it could also allow for a more complete picture of the participant's health status throughout the day by being able to measure step count as a proxy for overall respiratory health. Additionally, the DHT can help build that longitudinal look at the real world about how patients function in their day-to-day life in terms of how they're performing their activities of daily living, how they're going about, and actually valuing that and their quality of life and being able to measure that and rate that for to create a full picture. And then when we're thinking about those different digital health technologies, we have one that is an FDA-cleared one. We have a consumer activity tracker, and we do have a mobile app on a general computing platform such as a smartphone or a tablet. So there are different considerations that need to come into play, but we do, of course, still have to think about verification, validation, and usability studies. So when we're thinking about the FDA-cleared spirometer, we want to ensure that, of course, that what you're measuring in the clinical investigation is fit for purpose and in the context of use as to what is in the FDA clearance. We're talking about the consumer activity tracker and the mobile application. The considerations related to digital health technologies and general purpose computing platforms need to be thought of as appropriate for verification, validation, and usability studies, as you heard from my colleagues earlier. And additionally, just to note that we are able to collect through this hypothetical example and through these DHTs multiple different types of clinical outcome assessments. As we close out, I do want to point out a few of the resources that we walk through both in the draft guidance and you heard a little bit about from my colleagues earlier. So we have our Digital Health Center of Excellence webpage, which provides an overview and links to all the different digital health regulatory policies, as well as other information on how we as an agency are working and thinking about digital health. And then the 3 different qualification programs through the Drug Development Tools, the iSTAND program, pilot program, and the Medical Device Development Tools program. So in conclusion, DHTs have really revolutionized the ability to remotely obtain and analyze clinically relevant information from individuals. And compared to intermittent trial visits, you can use DHTs to remotely collect data from participants, which may allow for more continuous and more frequent data collection. DHTs provide that opportunity to record data directly from trial participants, whether you're talking about activities of daily living, sleep, etc., and where participants may actually be in their normal day-to-day lives, so at home, at school, work, outdoors. And some DHTs can also facilitate the direct collection of information from participants who otherwise would be unable to report their experiences. So for example, infants or individuals who might be cognitively impaired. And to underscore all of this, we really recognize that DHTs have so much promise to improve health and health outcomes, but we really want to also ensure that as you're thinking about use of digital health technologies, that you're also thinking about the full patient population and that you're building in diversity and health equity upfront so that we can truly realize the benefits and potential of digital health technologies to benefit all. So with that, we do have 2 challenge questions that we will ask you to respond to. The first one is, to select a DHT for a clinical investigation, the DHT should A, automatically sync a participant's data daily, B, never need to be charged, C, be fit for purpose, or D, belong to the participant. So please take a few moments to consider which answer you think is correct. The correct answer is C, that you should select a DHT for a clinical investigation that should be fit for purpose. The second challenge question is, which of the following statements is not true? A, verification is confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that the physical parameter that the DHT measures is measured accurately and precisely over time. B, validation is confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that the selected DHT appropriately assesses the clinical event or characteristic in the proposed participant population. C, usability studies are part of the verification process. And again, please take a few moments to consider which answer you think is correct. So the correct answer is C. Usability studies are not part of the verification process. With that, I would like to remind you all that please submit any comments you have on the draft guidance to the docket by March 22nd, 2022. Here's the link to the regulations.gov webpage. We look forward to hearing from you and any comments or feedback you have on the draft guidance. And if you have questions or further feedback, please feel free to reach out to Beth or myself, as well as the Digital Health mailbox. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues, and we look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentations. We'll now transition into the Q&A panel session. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions in the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Looks like we have some questions coming in right now. And it just so happens the first group of questions we'll direct to Dr. Sachs. And here is the first question. Could you please provide some examples of DHT?
Thanks very much, Ray. We've taken a pretty broad view to what constitutes DHT. As I mentioned in the introduction, they can include sensor-based devices like glucometers, blood pressure monitors, cardiac monitors, and things like that. They can include interactive apps that can be used on a cell phone, for example, things like vision tests, hearing tests, and so on, interactive tests for cognition or coordination. And they can just include the more pedestrian uses of supporting electronic patient-reported outcome tools and diaries. So those are some of the examples of DHTs that we have in mind as far as this guidance goes.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions for Dr. Sachs, and here is the next question. Could you please describe what you really consider the scope of the guidance?
Yeah, again, the scope is focused on clinical investigations, and the emphasis is really on clinical trials, but we realize that DHTs have a lot of other uses. They can be used potentially in post-marketing studies and phase 4 studies. They can be used for things other than gathering endpoints, for example, enrichment of patient populations with certain characteristics. So I think the scope is pretty broad, but it is focused on the use of these digital health technologies as tools in order to answer questions about a medical product, either a device or a drug. So I think that's the emphasis.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions for Dr. Sachs. And here's the next question. For data collected in a continuous stream, such as step trackers, is raw data expected to be submitted to the FDA with the analysis?
Thanks, Ray. So that's a tricky question because I think raw data is not a very clear entity. I think we appreciate that raw data may include sometimes things like just voltages or digital numbers in a program. It may include continuous traces, or it may include fairly processed data by algorithms within the digital health technology. For example, things like steps or coughs or sneezes or something like that. So I think it's very important to discuss what level of rawness of the data the review division is interested in. In general, we would sort of defer to the data output of the digital health technology. Another point just to bear in mind is that a lot of commercial digital health technologies or digital technologies have firmware with proprietary algorithms, and we wouldn't necessarily expect to see the raw data in those if the final data were processed by the algorithm. But obviously that would all depend on validation studies to show that the clinical characteristics that are being measured is being accurately captured by the device.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Sachs before we move on to the next round of questions for Dr. Kunkoski. And this is the last one for Dr. Sachs. And here's the question. Would FDA accept the data collected in other countries, and what are the requirements for such a collection?
Yeah, I don't see that we'd regard data coming from other countries any differently from here. I think the guidance articulates the standards which we would require to be able to rely on the DHT for making a clinical measurement. And again, we've articulated what we regard as clinically important endpoints or clinical features. So I think that would be the same. The data security and access controls and so on and so forth would also need to be the same. So I think we wouldn't have any different standard for the use of these DHTs in other countries. I think the same standards would apply, but we would certainly accept them if the data were adequate.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're going to move on to our next panelist now. And the next panelist up will be Dr. Kunkoski. And here's the first question. When you discuss endpoints, does this relate to only the specific endpoints defined by the clinical protocol, or any measurement the DAT may measure, for example, how often the participant may use the device that would normally be reported with the patient diary, etc.? Dr. Kunkoski, we can't hear you. If you could check your muting, and we'll give you just a more quick. All right, what we'll do is we'll send our tech team over to help Dr. Kunkoski while we move on to our next panelist, Dr. Saha. And we have some questions coming in for Dr. Saha. And here's the first question. What measures are in place to ensure the privacy of patients' personal sensitive information?
I think that's really going to be similar to any other type of medical product. So you want to ensure that you're able to keep the patient information private. And that's going to be an important consideration, especially related to digital health technologies more specifically, since they are used a lot across the.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Dr. Saha, and here is the question. Are there resources other than this draft guidance for sponsors considering the use of a DHT for a remote data acquisition and a clinical?
Well, I think that's, we do a lot of work collaboratively across different activities, whether it's through collaborative communities, public-private partnerships, especially thinking about the regulatory science considerations related to digital health technologies and what does that really look like. So we look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with the healthcare ecosystem on what's needed and what resources are really going to be impactful. And we also look forward to hearing from all of you through the comment period for the draft guidance in terms of, are there other resources or needs that you all have that, whether it's we FDA or the broader ecosystem, could help address.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got another question for Dr. Saha, and here's the question. Do you need to submit a COA dossier for a digital endpoint if it is a key endpoint? And are there examples you can provide of digital endpoints being included in an FDA-approved medical product label?
Thank you for that question. I think, similarly, as noted in the presentations, when you're thinking about what's needed in the dossier for a clinical outcome assessment, it's really going to be similar whether you are using a DHT to collect the clinical outcome assessment or not. And that information is going to be needed in the dossier for us to be able to review and evaluate the fit for purpose and context of use of the DHT for that specific clinical outcome assessment. We certainly are excited and already hearing from many companies who are interested in using DHTs in their clinical investigations. And certainly, as examples become public, we look forward to that information being available.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more for Dr. Saha. And here's the next question that just came in. Would you expect the same degree of validation work when using DHT for exploratory endpoint versus primary or secondary?
Again, it's really similar to any other clinical outcome assessment. So certainly the level of information, what we would be looking at for a primary endpoint is going to differ from a secondary versus an exploratory. I'd also point to a just released guidance from our center at CDRH regarding modifying existing patient-reported outcomes and thinking about the fact that you could leverage existing data or data, say, collecting an exploratory endpoint in a clinical investigation, then leverage that information for a future clinical trial. And that way you're not sort of redoing or reinventing the wheel in terms of evidence generation.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got one more question for Dr. Saha before we move over to Dr. Diamond. And here's the final question for Dr. Saha. With the availability of many DHTs, which could all provide value, how does the inclusion of multiple DHTs with more primary secondary endpoints than would be available in a traditional clinical trial affect the required size of those clinical trials?
Again, kind of similarly, at the end of the day, clinical trial and sample size calculation are really going to depend on what is it that you're measuring, what is the clinical investigation aim to do, and we really do appreciate and want people to leverage as much evidence as already existing so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel in terms of the evidence that you are looking to gather and use.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're now moving on to our next panelist, Dr. Diamond, and here's the first question. When should the FDA be consulted in the medical product development process?
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for the question. Well, we encourage that FDA be consulted early and often in the medical product development process. And there are numerous mechanisms to engage with the agency, and some of which are included in the guidance, and then there are some additional mechanisms as well. First and foremost, as described in the guidance, if you'd like to use a DHT to gather data for a clinical investigation of a particular medical product, it's important to communicate with the center responsible for the product that's the primary subject of the investigation. And the earlier you can obtain feedback from the review division in your focus area on the clinical investigation and the use of a novel tool for that study, the better. And it's much better to come in before you set up and conduct your study. So for investigations of drugs, that would be CDER, investigations of biologics, CBER, and investigations of medical devices, CDRH. And remember, at this point, we're not talking about the medical device status of the DHT that's intended to be used in the trial, but rather of the medical product that the DHT is being used to evaluate. And each center has a mechanism for these pre-submission related engagements, and we listed some guidance documents in the slides on these mechanisms. I also want to highlight again the tool development qualification programs we mentioned earlier, which are optional mechanisms to engage on the tools. And something else to highlight here, if you'd like to use a DHT to evaluate another medical product in a clinical investigation, if that DHT meets the definition of a medical device, and if you also have the intention of marketing that DHT as a medical device outside of the clinical investigation, then we would encourage you to come talk to us at CDRH just as we would for any other medical device that you intend to market. And maybe one other thing I can share on this is that there are a number of pre-competitive mechanisms that are available to discuss new ideas with FDA on investigations for medical products. And these include, for example, the Critical Path Initiative meetings, or CPIM. Specifically, the goals of these meetings are to discuss a particular methodology or technology for drug development proposed by a meeting requester, and for the agency to provide general advice on how that methodology or technology might enhance drug development. Now, these discussions in particular are non-regulatory, they're drug product independent, and they're not binding on the agency or the requester, but they can provide an important forum to discuss new ideas. And we are also available at the CDRH Digital Health Center of Excellence to discuss new ideas related to digital health technologies. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got another question for Dr. Diamond, and here's the question. What happens if the DHT is also classified as SAMD, and what are the requirements?
Thanks. So the question is about SAMD or SAMD, and the first thing that may be worth discussing related to this question is whether it matters if the DHT is classified specifically as SAMD, and what do we mean by SAMD? So SAMD, or short for software as a medical device, generally defined as software that meets the definition of a medical device by that FD&C Act definition I mentioned earlier, that's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes without being part of a hardware device. Now, there's also software in a medical device, or SIMD, which is software that meets the definition of a medical device and is used to control a hardware device or is necessary for a hardware device to achieve its intended use. So typically, SIMD is embedded within or is part of a hardware device. So SAMD and SIMD together comprise medical device software, for which we sometimes use the term device software functions. Because in our oversight of medical device software at CDRH, we generally take a function-based, platform-independent approach. We're most interested in what the software is intended to do, rather than whether it's running on a computer, a phone, a smartwatch, or some other platform or dedicated hardware device. So as long as the device software function adequately takes into account and addresses the particulars of what it may be running on. And if you'd like to read more about our approach, there are a few guidance documents I could recommend. One is the multiple functions device products guidance put out in 2020, and also our policy for device software functions and mobile medical applications, most recently issued in 2019. So I might rephrase the question as, what if a DHT is medical device software or incorporates medical device software? Because, again, there are similar implications whether the medical device software is SAMD or SIMD. So if the DHT that is intended to be used in a clinical investigation meets the definition of a device, then 21 CFR Part 812 applies. As I mentioned earlier, those are the investigational device exemption regulations. There are a lot of good resources on the FDA website related to these IDE requirements. I can recommend one in particular, and that's an FAQ about investigational device exemption. And we're always available to answer your questions, both at the CDRH Digital Health Center of Excellence and also within the review divisions of our Office of Product Evaluation and Quality.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions for Dr. Diamond, and here's the next question. Does a DHT need to be qualified before using it in a clinical investigation?
Thanks for the question. So a DHT or an endpoint related to a DHT does not need to go through our development tool qualification program to be used in the clinical investigation of a medical product. But as we mentioned earlier, there are some distinct advantages to doing that, particularly if the intention is to use the same DHT and specifically the same endpoint in a similar clinical context in multiple trials.
Thank you for responding to that question. Looks like we have one more question for Dr. Diamond before we move on to our next panelist, Dr. Webber. And here's the last question for Dr. Diamond in this round. What is FDA's expectation for the use of consumer or general purpose computing platforms in clinical studies? Does this draft guidance intend to expand FDA's regulatory oversight to include general purpose computing platforms?
Thanks for the question. Well, look, we acknowledge that general purpose computing platforms like laptop computers and smartphones play an important role in clinical investigations. But this guidance is not intended to expand FDA's regulatory oversight over these truly general purpose products. It's worth noting, though, it's the responsibility of the sponsors and investigators to choose the right hardware, to choose the right platforms, and to understand the impact of these general purpose platforms on the investigations.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions, and we'll now be moving on to our next panelist, Dr. Webber. And here's the first question for Dr. Webber. How would it be handled if subjects are using their own smartphone and the phone has a software update? Dr. Webber, we are not able to hear you right now. We'll give you just one more second to see if there's a technical solution we can provide before moving on to our next.
How about now? Okay, wonderful. Sorry, my computer is trying the wrong microphone. But what I was saying was that that's a great question, and it's actually applicable for either a participant's own DHT or if they're using a trial-provided DHT. We want to make sure that any software updates to the DHT or general purpose computing platform don't interfere with the data collection or the data transfer. And so that is definitely one part where we do cover it towards the end of the draft guidance.
Thank you for responding to that question. And we do have another question for Dr. Webber, and here's the question. When collected remotely, there is a higher probability of missing data. What is deemed acceptable in terms of missing data, and what evidence should sponsors provide to explain what's missing?
Thanks, Ray. That is also a really good question. Because of the digital environment, a participant might forget to wear their DHT or might forget to fill out their electronic patient-reported outcome instrument for a certain given day. So we do want sponsors to be aware of these possibilities and have a plan for when there is missing data. You know, there's not a hard and fast rule, as we often say at FDA. It depends. This is something that sponsors will need to take into consideration in how they're going to deal with the missing data and how that will be analyzed when it's complementing other types of evidence provided in a medical product submission. Thanks.
Thanks for responding to that question. Just to remind everyone, if you haven't had a chance to send your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. And we do have another question for Dr. Webber, and here's the question. If an individual is wearing their own DHT, which is different from the sponsor's DHT measuring a completely different endpoint, do we need to perform verification validation with the type of DHT that the patient is wearing?
That's also a great question. So all DHTs that are used in a protocol for a given clinical investigation should be verified, validated to provide similar data. So if the participant's own DHT is acceptable as defined by the protocol for the study, then we do want to make sure that the data that is coming from one DHT versus another make or model or different application on a general purpose computing platform, we want to make sure that the data coming from those different things are comparable across the board. So thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We had another question just come in for Dr. Webber, and here's the question. In a clinical study where we are using a PRO that has been validated in our patient population, what testing is required when this is administered using a digital device? Is it sufficient to just perform usability testing?
So when you're using an electronic, general purpose computing platform to administer an electronic patient-reported outcome or PRO instrument, we, in addition to all of the items that are covered in our recently finalized patient-reported outcomes guidance from CDRH, we would like you to consider the usability. So, the items covered in the PRO guidance, they include content validity and making sure that the items are measuring something of importance to clinicians and patients. So when you transition this over to a general purpose computing platform for administration, the usability is key, but we don't want to forget about the other items covered in our other guidances that are out there as well.
Thanks, Dr. Webber, for responding to that question. We have one more question, and here's the question. Who is responsible for validation?
Validation and verification are the sponsor's responsibility for making sure that a digital health technology is fit for purpose in a given clinical investigation. As a sponsor, you may rely on third-party data, whether that be from the DHT manufacturer or maybe some other publications out there in a comparable clinical population. But we do want to make sure that the DHT is fit for purpose and it's in the clinical investigation. It's measuring what you intend it to measure, and it's also able to perform in the clinical setting or the real-world setting that it is being used in.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're gonna loop back around and check back in with Dr. Kunkoski to see if our technical solution allows us to hear our audio. And here's the question. We'll read it out. Does FDA expect raw data from DHTs to be submitted as part of medical product submissions when DHTs are used to support endpoints? And if not, what level of granularity is expected?
Hello, can you hear me? Great, thank you so much. So this question is about source data, and I touched on that briefly in my presentation. And that a lot of that will depend on what the type of data you're collecting and how that is supporting the endpoint. So we first recommend you discuss with the review division of how they would like to see that data when you come in with their marketing application. But in general, you can, as long as you go through the verification and validation process, we should have comfort in the data that your DHT is generating. And then we can focus on the output of your DHT as your source data. And this could take the form of a discrete clinical event, such as a heartbeat or a breath, or continuous readings such as an electrocardiogram.
Thank you for responding to that question. And we do have another question for Dr. Kunkoski. And here's the next question. How are CDER and CDRH working together to leverage each other's expertise when reviewing DHTs used in trials? And are there considerations for joint meetings rather than going individually to each?
Absolutely. We have worked very closely, as you can see through this webinar and guidance. We have worked very closely through the Digital Health Center of Excellence. And as with any combination or a product or a medical product that overlaps between the two centers, you submit it to the center that has the appropriate jurisdiction and oversight of that investigational product. And through the consult process, we reach out to the other center to make sure they're engaged and consider their input, and they are involved through the whole review process.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions for Dr. Kunkoski. Here's the next question. How do you manage data across multiple sources, such as with a bring your own approach in a trial?
Sure, thank you. There needs to be a standard in place to ensure consistency and comparability of data collected, particularly with the bring your own approach. Sponsors should identify the minimum technical specifications and performance specifications that would allow use of the participant's own digital health technology in the clinical trial. Sometimes that includes specifying the specific brand, model, or version of technology you're using. And then sometimes they rely on different telecommunication technologies to support the transfer of data, such as broadband or cellular networks. The bring your own approach won't work in every trial. The sponsor needs to consider the pros and cons for a particular trial and decide the best business decision. The most important thing is, at the end of the day, do you have confidence in the data you're collecting to support the endpoint for your clinical investigation?
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions coming in right now for Dr. Kunkoski. And here's the next one. Will paper backups be required for all data that's acquired?
Fortunately, I can say no. We've moved past paper, and we are relying on, if you're remotely collecting data electronically, of course, that would be the source data. And we do have a guidance document on electronic source data, and also our draft guidance for industry on the use of electronic records and electronic signatures in clinical investigations under Part 11 addresses a lot of those aspects of how we are moving away from paper records.
Thank you for responding to that question. I have a couple more questions for Dr. Kunkoski. Would FDA accept data collected by?
So that depends. I mean, in a clinical trial where a patient is using a digital health technology, you are always relying on the patient to collect that data is recorded from the patient regularly, and you're using that most likely to support an endpoint in your clinical investigation. I'm not sure if you mean something outside of a clinical investigation or more of a bring your own approach. As I mentioned earlier, you really have to think through the bring your own approach and make sure that there's a protocol defining the technology, the parameters for wear time, and that the data will support the endpoint that you've pre-specified.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Kunkoski before we go back up to the top of our panel for Dr. Sachs. And here's the last question for Dr. Kunkoski. How will remote patient monitoring sensors sending data to the cloud for analysis be regulated by FDA?
Sure. So this is where Part 11 plays a significant role, in that there is a Part 11 draft guidance out that I mentioned earlier, and it discusses outsourced electronic services such as cloud computing services. And we certainly recognize that these are playing a significant role in how DHT data is collected. Sponsors and other regulated entities are ultimately responsible for meeting the regulatory requirements of Part 11 to be able to ensure the authenticity and reliability of data that will ultimately be used to support a marketing application. But data sponsors need to validate that the electronic data repository where they're storing the data complies with Part 11. They need to verify that there's access controls and audit trail. And again, the validation of the electronic system, which is independent of the DHT validation process. But Part 11 is always required for any data used to support a marketing application. And it doesn't matter what type of DHT that the data is derived from.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're going back to the beginning of our panel with visiting with Dr. Leonard, Dr. Sachs, and this is the first question for Dr. Sachs. Are there any specific requirements for the informed consent form when DHT is used?
Thanks, Ray. No, there really aren't. I think, when we have a guidance out on electronic informed consent, and that guidance envisaged the use of multiple different platforms, and many of the requirements for electronic informed consent are covered there. I think the principles that Beth has already spoken about data security and audit trails would apply to electronic informed consent as well, because these are electronic records and they're obviously subject to Part 11 regulations as well. But apart from those regulations, no, there are really no differences, and we have separate guidances on the content of informed consent, and the content of informed consent should be the same, whether it's paper-based or electronic-based.
Thank you for responding to that question. Next question for Dr. Sachs, and here it is. What is the level of sponsor oversight on maintaining the chain of custody from, say, the patient's own device to the final data set for submission?
There are a couple of considerations. As we sort of look at the trajectory of data from the patient, the first thing I think we would be concerned about is access controls. Now, there are certain digital health technologies where access controls can be implemented, for example, patient-reported outcome tools and so on, and that would be the first gatekeeper. We do recognize that there are many other technologies like actigraphs and so on where access controls are not practical, and in those we would not expect that. Once the data leaves the digital health technology that the patient has, it's important for sponsors to ensure that the transmission of the data to a durable data repository is secure. So we need to be reassured that there's a secure conduit for data. And once it enters a durable data repository, which may be either owned by the sponsor or contracted by the vendor, Part 11 requirements apply. So once the data enter these sort of repositories, it would be necessary to have a date time stamp. It would be necessary to know where the data came from, and there should be an audit trail documenting any changes to the data.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Sachs, and here's the question. How important is the endpoint versus the device? Can you use new devices to measure endpoints that have been qualified?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. It's important to differentiate between the endpoint, which is a clinical thing, a clinical feature, and the device, which is really just a tool to measure it. So we just to use an example, for example, of a thermometer. I mean, if we imagine the options of using a digital thermometer or mercury thermometer, I don't think anyone would care which technology was used as long as the results were accurate. So when we're talking about an existing endpoint, which is valid, at least from a clinical point of view, how you actually measure it doesn't matter as long as the validation, the verification validations show that you're getting an accurate measurement. The clinical phenomenon obviously is a completely separate thing. It has nothing to do with the device, and that has to be evaluated by clinicians and patients and caregivers and other stakeholders in the clinical realm. So I think a great question. It's very important to separate the technology, which is just a tool to measure things, and the measurement itself, which is a clinical thing.
Thank you for responding to that question. I think you may have been cut off just a little bit. I don't know if we heard the end of that. If you could just recap the last part of what you were saying.
Sure. No, I was just saying that digital health technologies are just tools to make the measurement, and the actual clinical endpoint or the feature, the clinical feature that you're measuring, has nothing to do with the technology. That's a clinical phenomenon, and that would have to be evaluated by clinicians and caregivers and patients and so on.
Thank you for providing that summary for us, Dr. Sachs. We're going to go back around on our panelists to check in with Dr. Diamond. We had a few more questions coming for Dr. Diamond, and here is the first question. Are there advantages to using a device DHT as opposed to a non-device DHT? For example, the ability to use the DHT for a use cleared by CDER.
Thanks very much for the question. So the way I would think about this is whether you need to use a DHT that is a device rather than a DHT that is not a device in your investigation, I think depends on the needs of the investigation. Since whether a particular DHT meets the definition of a device is dependent on largely its intended use and how it functions. And so if you need to measure glucose, for example, that's a medical device function, and you would need to use a device DHT. The advantages of using a device that is cleared is that you can leverage the data from the review of that device by CDRH, and so for those that need to use device DHTs, we anticipate that most of those devices would receive marketing authorization if marketing authorization is required for that product category. And so, for example, again, to use the glucometer example, I think that an investigator would receive a lot of questions from an IRB if they intended to use a glucometer that was not cleared by the agency. So hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. Looks like we've got just a couple of minutes left. And this is one last question for Dr. Diamond. And here's the question. If a DHT is deemed as an investigational device that requires an IDE submission, and this DHT is intended to be used in a drug clinical trial, is FDA direction to submit both an IND and an IDE, or which is appropriate?
Thanks for the question. And there is a note specifically about this in the guidance. in the circumstance where a DHT may meet the definition of a significant risk device. So in this case, we anticipate that information contained in the IND would also be required for the IDE. And so we would encourage those sponsors to come talk to us at CDRH so that we can streamline that application process consistent with our least burdensome approach overall. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. Well, we have just less than 1 minute left, and we want to thank our panel for their very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to numerous questions that came in. We do have a few closing reminders. This activity is eligible for an attendance certificate, which supports continuing education by SOCRA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CDER-SBIA for more details. You will be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which remains for 2 weeks. That's February the 24th. Please remember to download the certificate immediately upon completing the survey. It cannot be retrieved after the fact. Let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. This will help guide the design of our future events. Additional tutorials are available through fda.gov/CDERLearn. On behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at fda.gov/CDER-SBIA. Thank you.